There is a king in the depths of Drangleic who no longer remembers his name. He wanders in circles through a crypt beneath his own kingdom, clutching a sword too heavy to lift, wearing a crown that no longer means anything. He is hollow, forgotten, and utterly alone. And yet, he was once the greatest monarch the world had ever seen. This is the story of King Vendrick, the man who conquered nations, who built an empire on the bones of giants, and who loved a woman so deeply that it destroyed everything he ever fought for. This is a story about ambition, betrayal, and the curse that no amount of power can escape. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through the complete tragedy of Vendrick's rise and fall. From his early days as a conqueror to his final, hollow wandering in the undead crypt. Before the banners of Drangleic ever flew over the jagged cliffs of the north, Vendrick was not a man of destiny, nor was he the heir to a crumbling throne. He was a conqueror in the most primal sense of the word. Long before he became the king of Drangleic, he was a powerful warrior, a nameless champion who wandered through the dust of civilizations that had already been forgotten by time. In the world of Dark Souls 2, kingdoms rise and fall like the tide, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and fading memories. Vendrick emerged from this cycle not as a savior, but as a force of nature who understood that in a world of fading fire, power is the only true currency. He didn't wait for a prophecy to crown him. He went out into the world and claimed the souls of 4 great ones who held the fragments of the ancient Lord Souls. These 4 great ones were the inheritors of the strength of the old world, beings who had unknowingly harbored the embers of Gwyn's original age. Vendrick's ascent was fueled by the literal consumption of these entities. He didn't just defeat them, he harvested their essence to forge his own legend. This is the fundamental truth of Vendrick's origin. He built his empire on top of a graveyard. He arrived in the land that would become Drangleic as an outsider, she an invader who saw the potential in the ruins of the past. He recognized that the land was fertile with the remains of previous cycles, and he used the raw soul power he had seized to impose his will upon the geography itself. He was a man who believed that history could be rewritten if the ink was dark enough and the hand was strong enough. His early ambitions were shaped by a desire to create something that would finally endure. Vendrick had seen the patterns of the world. He had walked through the old things that the Emerald Herald eventually speaks of. He wanted to build a kingdom that wasn't beholden to the whims of the old gods, a place where humanity could finally stand on its own feet. His relationship with his brother, Aldia, was the intellectual engine of this ambition, while Vendrick provided the physical strength and the political leadership. The two of them shared a vision of a world that had moved past the lie of the sun. In these early days, Vendrick was a figure of immense charisma and terrifying capability, a man who believed he could solve the problems of the world through sheer, overwhelming force. There was a certain rugged pragmatism to the young Vendrick. He wasn't interested in the flowery rituals of the Way of White or the fading traditions of Anor Londo. He saw a world in disarray and decided that he was the only one capable of organizing it. This early ambition wasn't necessarily born of greed, but of a specific kind of arrogance. The arrogance of a man who has never known defeat. He believed that if he could just gather enough souls, he could become a god in all but name, creating a kingdom so vast and so structured that even the undead curse would find no purchase within its borders. He was the architect of his own myth, carving his name into the stone before the first castle was even built. Ultimately, the man Vendrick was before the crown was a warrior philosopher who saw the world as a puzzle to be solved. He didn't inherit the greatness of Drangleic. He manufactured it from the raw materials of the abyss and the dying light. He was a man who took the land by force because he believed he was the only one worthy of it. This period of his life was the golden dawn of his reign, a time when anything felt possible, and the weight of the crown hadn't yet begun to crush his spirit. He was the great soul of his age, a titan walking among men who were all too eager to follow a leader who finally seemed to have the answer to the encroaching dark. While Vendrick was busy taming the land and subduing the local lords, his brother Aldia was retreating into the shadows of the intellectual world. The relationship between the two brothers is one of the most important dynamics in the lore of Dark Souls 2, as it represents the two different ways a human can respond to a dying world, through political power or through forbidden knowledge. Aldia didn't care for the pomp and circumstance of the court. He established a manor far from the prying eyes of the public, and there he began the study of souls. Together, the two brothers sought to understand the very essence of the soul, what it was, how it could be manipulated, and why it was tied to the fading of the fire. In these quiet, early years, their research was a collaborative effort to stabilize the kingdom. Vendrick provided the subjects and the resources, while Aldia provided the analytical mind. They were trying to look under the hood of reality itself. They wanted to know if the soul was something that could be refined, protected, or even replaced. Aldia's manor became a laboratory for the most horrific and profound experiments in human history. They were looking for a way to transcend the first sin, though at the time they likely didn't even have a name for it. They were simply two brothers who loved their kingdom and wanted to make sure it never had to end. So this was the period of quiet research that would eventually lead to the most catastrophic discoveries in the series. The divide between the two began to grow as their research deepened. Vendrick was the statesman. He needed practical applications for their work. He wanted stronger soldiers, more efficient golems, and a way to keep his people from hollowing. He saw soul science as a tool for governance. Aldia, however, was becoming a true scientist, driven by a curiosity that had no ethical boundaries. He began to realize that the soul wasn't just a battery, it was a prison. He became obsessed with the disparity of the world, the constant tension between life and death, light and dark. While Vendrick was using the knowledge to solidify his rule and build his golden age, Aldia was beginning to suspect that the very foundation of their reality was a lie. This philosophical divide was subtle at first. Vendrick would visit the manor, and they would discuss the progress of their work over maps and ancient scrolls. But the air in the manor was growing thick with the smell of formaldehyde and the echoes of things that shouldn't exist. Vendrick began to realize that his brother was going down a path that he couldn't follow. He needed to be a king for the living, while Aldia was becoming a king for the dead and the reborn. Despite this, Vendrick never stopped supporting his brother. He trusted Aldia more than anyone else in the world, and that trust would eventually become one of his greatest weaknesses. He allowed the experiments to continue because he hoped Aldia would find the one thing he couldn't conquer with a sword, a cure for the curse. The study of souls was the secret heart of Drangleic. While the people in the streets of Majula or the soldiers in the forest of fallen giants saw a kingdom of stone and steel, the real Drangleic was being built in the test tubes and cages of Aldia's manor. The brothers were playing with the fire of the gods, trying to manufacture a new kind of existence. They were trying to create a true monarch through science before the gods could do it through prophecy. This intellectual ambition was the ultimate expression of the Age of Men. They didn't want the gods' help. They wanted to take the gods' tools and do a better job with them. The founding of Drangleic was not a peaceful unification, but a systematic dismantling of the old ones. These beings were the inheritors of the Lord's souls, the same primal energies that had belonged to Nito, the Witch of Izalith, and the other titans of the first game. By the time Vendrick arrived, these souls had manifested in new, twisted forms, but their power was still the foundational energy of the world. Vendrick hunted them down one by one. This was the true beginning of Drangleic. He claimed their strength to build a centralized, massive empire that would span the entire continent. He was the first human king in history to truly rival the ancient gods in raw soul power, not because he was divine, but because he was the ultimate scavenger. By defeating these inheritors, Vendrick wasn't just killing monsters, he was reclaiming the power of the world for humanity. He took the great souls and used them as the cornerstones of his new kingdom. This gave him a level of authority that no previous human ruler had ever possessed. He could dictate the laws of reality within his borders because he carried the weight of the universe in his own soul. He used this power to pacify the warring tribes and local lords who had been fighting over the scraps of previous cycles. He offered them a choice: join the new order or be crushed by the power of the Great Ones. Most joined, and those who didn't became the first residents of his dungeons. The centralized nature of Drangleic was a direct reflection of Vendrick's own singular strength. He didn't believe in a pantheon of gods or a decentralized system of lords. He believed in the crown. Everything in the kingdom flowed toward the center, toward Vendrick. He used the souls he had captured to fuel the creation of his massive infrastructure. He was building an empire that was designed to be total. Every road, every bridge, and every fort was a physical manifestation of his dominance. He was trying to create a world that was so logically and physically sound that it would be immune to the chaos that had destroyed the kingdoms of the past. He wanted to be the first king to build something that would never fall. This era of conquest was the most successful period of Vendrick's life. He was a hero to his people, a man who had ended the dark ages of the interregnum and brought order to a chaotic land. He was seen as a giant among men, and his physical stature began to reflect his spiritual density. As he consumed more souls, he literally grew in size, becoming a towering figure that loomed over his subjects. This reinforced the idea that he was something more than human. He was a lord in the truest sense of the word. He had taken the fire of the ancients and used it to light the hearth of a new human civilization. However, the founding of Drangleic carried an invisible price. By building his kingdom on the souls of the old ones, Vendrick was tethering his fate to the very cycle he was trying to escape. You cannot use the energy of the past to build a future that is truly different. He was recycling the same great souls that had been causing the world to rot for eons. He was building his castle on a foundation of radioactive material, and though it looked magnificent in the sun, the rot was already present in the stones themselves. He had conquered the ancient powers, but he had also invited their baggage into his house. At its height, Drangleic was a miracle of engineering and prosperity, a kingdom that felt like a permanent answer to the question of human survival. The centerpiece of this era was the construction of Drangleic Castle itself. It wasn't just a fortress, it was a statement. Built atop a high mountain pass, the castle looked down over the entire realm. its spires reaching for a sky that seemed, for the first time in history, to belong to humanity. This was a kingdom of men, where the influence of the gods had seemingly been replaced by the brilliance of human structure. There were no cathedrals to Gwyndolin, or altars to the nameless king here. Instead, there were halls of law, barracks of steel, and a throne that commanded the respect of the world. The prosperity of this golden age was unlike anything the land had seen before. With the great souls under his control, Vendrick was able to ensure that his people were fed, protected, and productive. Trade flourished, and the kingdom expanded its reach far beyond its original borders. This wasn't the survivalist existence of the undead in Lordran. This was a thriving society. There was a sense of progress, a belief that humanity had finally matured past the need for divine supervision. Vendrick's reign was characterized by a massive investment in the material world. He wanted his people to have homes, families, and futures. He wanted them to forget that the sun was a dying ember. The architecture of Drangleic reflected this focus on the human will. Everything was massive, heavy, and built to last. The bridges were thick stone, the walls were impenetrable, and the castles were designed with a sense of mathematical perfection. This was Vendrick's Age of Men in physical form. He was trying to create a world that was so solid that it would simply refuse to crumble. He believed that if he could just build enough structure, he could keep the greyness of the world at bay. The golden age of Drangleic was a period of intense confidence, where the king and his people felt that they had finally mastered the art of living in a world of cycles. But there was a strange, sterile quality to this prosperity. Drangleic felt like a kingdom that was holding its breath. Because it was so centralized and so focused on Vendrick's power, there was little room for the organic chaos of life. Everything was ordered, everything was regulated, and everything was in service to the crown. It was a golden age of stability, but it was also a golden age of stagnation. The people were safe, but they were living in a world that was increasingly detached from the natural world. Vendrick had built a beautiful, golden cage for his people, and for a long time they were happy to live inside it, because it was better than the alternative of hollowing in the woods. This was the peak of the mountain. From the top of Drangleic Castle, Vendrick could look out over a kingdom that he had forged from nothing. He had the love of his people, the loyalty of his knights, and the power of the Great Ones. He felt that he had truly won. He had done what no human had ever done. He had built a world for humans, by humans, using the strength of the gods. But the problem with golden ages is that they are always followed by the twilight. Vendrick didn't realize that by building his kingdom so high, he had only ensured that the eventual fall would be more devastating. He was basking in the light of a sun that was already setting. At the height of his power, Vendrick was served by two legendary knights who represented the dual nature of his kingdom. Velstadt, the royal aegis, and Raime, the rebel. These two men were the pillars of Vendrick's military and political strength, but their differing philosophies foreshadowed the internal rot that would eventually destroy Drangleic. Velstadt was a man of blind loyalty. He came from a distant land of the dead, but he found a purpose in Vendrick's service. He was the king's shadow, a massive gold-clad warrior who believed that the king's word was the final law of the universe. To Velstadt, there was no room for doubt or questioning. You served the crown because the crown was the only thing keeping the dark away. Raime, on the other hand, was the skeptic. He was just as powerful as Velstadt, but he lacked his colleagues' unwavering faith. Raime was a man who looked at the foundation of the kingdom and saw the cracks. He was suspicious of the research being done at Aldia's manor, and he was even more suspicious of the king's growing obsession with soul manipulation. Raime believed that a knight's duty was to protect the kingdom, not just the king. He was the voice of dissent in Vendrick's inner circle, the one who wasn't afraid to tell the king when he was wrong. This created a permanent tension at the heart of the court, a conflict between the Aegis, who protected the status quo, and the rebel who wanted to fix it. This divide between the two knights was a microcosm of the kingdom's own internal struggle. On one side, you had the people who wanted to ignore the problems and focus on the prosperity. On the other, you had the people who realized that the Golden Age was built on a fragile lie. Vendrick, for a long time, she was able to balance these two forces. He valued Velstadt's protection and Raime's honesty. He felt that having both perspectives made him a better ruler. But as the darkness began to creep in, the king found it harder and harder to listen to the skeptic. He wanted the comfort of the Aegis more than the hard truths of the rebel. The inner circle was also rounded out by other figures, like the Chancellor and the various lords of the realm. But it was Velstadt and Raime who truly defined the soul of Vendrick's reign. They were the ones who saw the king behind closed doors. They saw the moments of doubt and the flashes of brilliance. They were the brothers in arms who had helped Vendrick conquer the Great Ones. The fact that these two men, who had fought side by side to build Drangleic, and would eventually turn on each other, is one of the great tragedies of the era. It proved that even the strongest bonds of loyalty couldn't survive the pressure of a world that was slowly losing its mind. Ultimately, the fracture in the inner circle was the beginning of the end for the kingdom. When the king's two most trusted advisors can no longer agree on the path forward, the kingdom is already lost. Velstadt's blindness would eventually lead him to guard a hollow shell, while Raime's rebellion would lead him into the arms of a different kind of darkness. They were the two halves of Vendrick's own heart, and as they drifted apart, the king began to lose his grip on reality. He was a man who needed both the shield and the sword, but he was slowly choosing the shield, withdrawing from the world and the difficult truths that Raime represented. The true turning point in the history of Drangleic began not with a war, but with the arrival of a single woman. One day, a woman of unparalleled beauty appeared at the gates of Drangleic Castle. She claimed to be from a distant land across the sea, and she brought with her a warning that would change the course of human history. This was Nashandra. She told Vendrick of a looming threat, a race of giants who lived across the ocean and who possessed a power that could potentially destroy everything he had built. She spoke with a voice that was calm, wise, and seemingly filled with concern for the safety of Drangleic. Vendrick, despite his immense power, was a man who lived in a constant state of secret anxiety. He knew that the fire was fading, and he knew that his kingdom was built on borrowed time. When Nashandra arrived, she offered him exactly what he needed, a target for his fear. She gave his anxiety a face and a name. She told him that the giants held the key to a great strength that Drangleic lacked. She didn't come as a conqueror or a threat. She came as a savior. She was the one who knew things that the king did not. She arrived at the perfect moment when the Golden Age was starting to feel a bit too quiet. and the king was looking for a new mission to define his reign. The king was immediately captivated by her. It wasn't just her physical beauty, although that was certainly a factor. It was the rightness of her message. She seemed to understand the weight of the crown in a way that his knights and even his brother did not. She validated his desire to protect his people at any cost. Nashandra became his closest advisor, displacing even Aldia in the king's confidence. She brought a new kind of energy to the court, a focused, cold ambition that replaced the optimistic progress of the early years. She was the queen the kingdom didn't know it was waiting for. What the kingdom didn't realize was that Nashandra's arrival was a calculated move by a fragment of the abyss. She didn't just happen to show up. She had sought out the strongest monarch in the world so she could use his strength for her own ends. She saw in Vendrick a man of incredible want, even if he didn't realize it himself. He wanted to be the perfect king. He wanted to save the world. He wanted to be loved. Nashandra was the mirror that reflected all of those desires back at him, distorted into a single purpose. She was the dark that had learned how to wear a silk dress and speak in a soft voice. Her arrival marked the end of the human era of Drangleic and the beginning of the abyssal era. Before her, the kingdom's problems were the problems of men, politics, resources, and engineering. After her, the problems became cosmic. She brought with her the scent of the ancient dark, a feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. But because she was so beautiful and her warnings were so dire, no one questioned her. They were too busy preparing for the war she had promised them. Nashandra didn't have to fire a single arrow to begin the destruction of Drangleic. She only had to speak into the ear of a man who was afraid of the dark. Nashandra quickly became more than just an advisor. She became Vendrick's queen. Their marriage was seen as the union of the two most powerful beings in the world, a match made in heaven that would surely secure the future of the kingdom. Vendrick loved her with a passion that bordered on obsession. To him, she was the personification of the light he was trying to preserve. He saw her as his partner in the grand project of Drangleic. But this love was the medium through which Nashandra's subtle corruption began to flow. She didn't use force to change the king's mind. She used want. She convinced him, bit by bit, that his kingdom was incomplete and that his legacy was at risk. Her influence was like a slow-acting poison. She would sit with him in the private chambers of the castle, whispering about the stolen power of the giants. She made him feel that he was being a coward by not taking what was rightfully his. She framed the invasion of the giants not as an act of aggression, but as a preemptive strike to save his people. She played on his fatherly instincts, making him believe that he was failing his subjects by leaving the giant threat unaddressed. She turned his greatest strength, his desire to protect, into his greatest weakness. Under her guidance, the king's decisions began to shift away from building and toward conquest. This corruption extended beyond the king to the very culture of the kingdom. The court began to reflect Nashandra's cold, hungry spirit. The optimism of the early years was replaced by a sense of impending doom and a desperate need for more souls. The research at Aldia's manor took a darker turn, as Nashandra encouraged the brothers to look deeper into the dark as a source of power. She was guiding them toward the abyss, making it seem like a tool they could master, rather than a force that would eventually consume them. She was the engine of desire, that kept the kingdom moving toward its own destruction. Vendrick was blinded by his affection. He couldn't see the void behind her eyes, because he was too busy looking at the reflection of his own greatness in them. He trusted her more than he trusted himself. When Raime or Aldia tried to voice their concerns, Vendrick saw it as an attack on his wife, and by extension, an attack on his heart. Nashandra had effectively isolated the king from the people who could have saved him. She had made herself the only person he could talk to, the only person who truly understood him. This emotional isolation was the first step in the king's hollowing, long before the dark sign ever appeared. The subtle corruption of Nashandra is a reminder that the greatest threats in the Dark Souls universe aren't always giant monsters with swords. Sometimes the greatest threat is the person sitting next to you, telling you exactly what you want to hear. She was the shard of want that had found a host in the most powerful man in the world. She didn't need to destroy Drangleic. She just needed to make Vendrick want to destroy it himself. She convinced him that to be a true monarch, he had to take the power of the giants. And Vendrick, driven by love and a manufactured fear, decided to follow her into the dark. The decision to cross the sea and invade the land of the giants was the moment the golden age of Drangleic officially ended. It was a choice born of a toxic mixture of love, manipulated fear, and the desperate need to solve the problem of the fading fire. Vendrick, urged on by Nashandra, came to believe that the giants possessed a great soul or a kinship that could provide a permanent solution to the undead curse. He believed that by stealing this power, he could finally fulfill his promise to his people and create a kingdom that would truly never end. This was not a war of honor or defense. It was a raid of desperation. The king's announcement of the war was met with a mixture of excitement and dread. For the soldiers, it was a chance to prove their worth in a grand crusade. For the advisors like Raime, it was a terrifying escalation of a conflict that didn't need to exist. But Vendrick was resolute. He had convinced himself that this was the only way. He viewed the giants not as a living culture, but as a resource to be harvested. This dehumanization, or de-giantization, was necessary for him to justify the atrocity he was about to commit. He was a king who had become so obsessed with saving his people that he was willing to destroy another race to do it. The crossing of the sea was a massive undertaking, a display of the full naval and soul power of Drangleic. Thousands of ships, fueled by the strength of the great souls, she moved toward the distant horizon. Vendrick led from the front, a towering figure in his golden armor, the literal son of his people, moving toward a land of shadows. He felt that he was a hero, a savior king who was taking a necessary risk for the greater good. But in reality, he was a thief. He was leading his people into a cycle of vengeance that would eventually return to haunt his own shores. Nashandra watched from the cliffs as the fleet departed, a cold smile on her face. She had succeeded in turning the world's greatest protector into its most powerful predator. She knew that the war would weaken both sides, and more importantly, she knew that the prize Vendrick brought back would be exactly what she needed to open the way to the first flame. The decision to invade the giants was the first stitch in the shroud of Drangleic. It was the moment the kingdom stopped being a place of human flourishing and became a place of cosmic crime. This part of the story highlights the tragic irony of Vendrick's character. He was a man who hated the lie of the gods, yet he was willing to commit a godlike atrocity to maintain his own lie of a permanent kingdom. He was trying to cheat the universe, and the giants were the collateral damage. The invasion was a masterstroke of manipulation, a war that was fought for the wrong reasons, led by the wrong person, at the behest of the wrong queen. Vendrick thought he was sailing toward salvation. In reality, he was sailing toward the point of no return. The war across the sea was not a campaign of grand maneuvers or noble duels. It was a meat grinder of cosmic proportions. When Vendrick's fleet arrived on the shores of the land of the giants, they encountered a race that was fundamentally alien to the human experience of Drangleic. The giants were not just large men. They were creatures of stone and spirit, beings whose very existence was tied to a singular, ancient harmony. Vendrick's forces, fueled by the aggressive soul arts of Aldia and the steel of the royal swordsman, descended upon them with a ferocity born of manufactured desperation. The battles were apocalyptic. The ground shook with the footfalls of the giant lord, and the sky was choked with the smoke of burning forests and shattered citadels. For the first time, Vendrick's men realized that they weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting a force of nature that didn't know how to surrender. The destruction was absolute. Vendrick, leading from the front with his massive ultra-greatsword, became a figure of terror to the giants. He was the invader from the sea, a thief who had come to pluck the heart out of their world. The war dragged on for what felt like an age, turning the beautiful, rugged landscapes of the giants' home into a scarred wasteland of ash and bone. This was the moment where the Golden Age soldiers of Drangleic lost their innocence. They saw things that couldn't be explained by the logic of their home, giants who turned into trees upon death, and a giant lord whose roar could shatter the resolve of even the bravest knight. It was a war of total attrition, where every inch of ground was paid for in a mountain of corpses. Despite the giants' immense strength, they were ultimately unprepared for the want of humanity. Vendrick's army was driven by a hunger that the giants couldn't comprehend. We see the remnants of this brutality in the memories of the fallen, the images of fire raining from the sky, and the screams of a race being systematically dismantled. Vendrick wasn't just winning battles, he was erasing a culture. He believed that by destroying the giants, he was securing the immortality of Drangleic. He saw the giant lord as the ultimate obstacle to his people's survival, and he struck with a cold, calculated efficiency that bordered on the monstrous. This was the dark side of Vendrick's leadership, the ability to commit unspeakable acts if he believed the greater good demanded them. The giant lord eventually fell, or was at least driven back far enough for Vendrick to achieve his true goal. But the victory was hollow. The soldiers who returned to the ships were not the same men who had left the docks of Drangleic. They were haunted, their eyes filled with the sight of a world they had broken for a prize they didn't understand. They brought back prizes, huge shackled giants and strange glowing artifacts, but they also brought back a lingering sense of doom. They had stirred a hornet's nest of cosmic proportions, and the silence that followed the invasion was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath. The war had ended, but the consequences were only just beginning to take shape. This part of the narrative serves as a grim reminder that Vendrick's heroism was always a matter of perspective. To the people of Drangleic, he was the conqueror who had subdued a distant threat. To the giants, he was a demon who had stolen their very essence. The giant war was the original sin of Drangleic, a crime against the natural order that would eventually demand a price the kingdom couldn't afford to pay. Vendrick had won the war, but in doing so, he had transformed his kingdom from a miracle of human engineering into a target for universal vengeance. He returned home a victor, But the shadow of the giant lord was already stretching across the sea, following the scent of the stolen souls. When Vendrick returned to Drangleic, he did not come back empty-handed. He brought with him the prized knowledge of the giants' souls, and more importantly, the giants themselves. This was the moment of the great theft. Vendrick and Aldia began to dissect the essence of the giants, discovering that their souls were denser and more resilient than the flickering souls of men. They found a way to bridge the gap between soul and matter, leading to the creation of the golems. These massive hollow constructs were powered by the literal souls of the defeated giants. They were the ultimate labor force, tireless, obedient, and capable of moving mountains. This stolen power allowed Vendrick to accelerate the growth of his kingdom at a rate that defied the laws of nature. The most visible result of this stolen power was the completion of Drangleic Castle. What should have taken decades of human labor was finished in a matter of days. The golems, acting as the silent, mechanical slaves of the king, hoisted massive stones into place, carving the spires and ramparts directly out of the mountain. The castle became a monument to the king's new, unnatural strength. Every door that opened, every elevator that rose, and every statue that stood guard was powered by a trapped giant's soul. This was the peak of Vendrick's hubris. He believed he had found a way to bypass the limitations of the human spirit. He thought he had outsmarted the cycle by using the immortality of the giants to fuel the temporary structures of men. However, this victory was the very moment the kingdom's doom was sealed. By using the golems, Vendrick had literally built his throne on the backs of his enemies. The castle was alive with the silent, screaming energy of the giants he had enslaved. It created an atmosphere of sterile, artificial perfection. The age of men that Vendrick had dreamed of was no longer human. It was a hybrid of stolen divinity and mechanical cruelty. The golems were a constant reminder that Drangleic's prosperity was artificial. They were hollow in a way that foreshadowed the fate of the people themselves. Vendrick had taken a shortcut to greatness, and the universe was beginning to take notice of the debt he was accruing. Nashandra's role in this cannot be overstated. She was the one who encouraged the use of the golems, knowing that the more Vendrick relied on this stolen power, the more he was alienating himself from his own humanity. She wanted the castle to be a fortress of the dark, and the golems were the perfect guardians for such a place. She watched as the king grew more detached, spending his days in the throne room, surrounded by his stone servants. The stolen power of the giants didn't bring Vendrick the peace he sought. It brought him a sense of cold, heavy isolation. He was no longer a king of people. He was becoming a king of things. The golems represent the falseness of Drangleic's glory. They were impressive to behold, but they were built on a foundation of atrocity. The giant's kinship, the mysterious power that allowed one to command the golems and reach the throne of want, was the true prize Nashandra was after. By teaching Vendrick how to use this power, she had effectively set the trap. She had turned the king into the custodian of a power he didn't fully understand, making him the keeper of the very key she needed to unlock the abyss. The stolen power of the giants was a poison disguised as a gift, and by the time Vendrick realized the cost, the golems had already finished building his tomb. Just as Drangleic reached its most magnificent height, the cracks began to appear in the form of the dark sign. It started as a rumor in the distant provinces. Men and women who could not die, whose flesh began to rot and whose memories began to leak away like water from a cracked jar. Despite the stolen power of the giants and the brilliance of his architecture, Vendrick found himself powerless against the creeping rot of the undead curse. It was the ultimate insult to his age of men. He had conquered the four great ones, he had enslaved the giants, and he had built a castle that touched the clouds. Yet he could not stop his own subjects from turning into mindless husks. The curse was the one enemy that couldn't be fought with a sword or locked behind a stone wall. The spread of the curse reshaped the very social fabric of the kingdom. Fear replaced prosperity. The once thriving trade routes became dangerous paths, infested with the hollowed. The king's soldiers, who had once been the pride of the realm, were now tasked with the grim duty of rounding up their own neighbors. Vendrick watched from his balcony as the lights in the villages below went out one by one. He realized that his golden age was an illusion. The fire was fading, and no amount of stolen giant souls could provide enough fuel to keep it lit forever. The dark sign was a physical manifestation of the world's demand for the cycle to turn, a reminder that humanity's time was up. Vendrick's reaction to the curse was one of quiet, desperate panic. He doubled down on his research with Aldia, pouring the kingdom's remaining resources into finding a cure. But every experiment failed. They tried to soul-stitch, they tried to create artificial lives, and they tried to harness the power of the dragons. Nothing worked. The curse was not a disease. It was a law of physics in the Age of Fire. The more Vendrick fought it, the more he realized that he was fighting against the very nature of existence. This was the beginning of his deep, philosophical depression. He saw his people suffering and knew that his great strength was effectively useless. He was a giant who couldn't swat a fly. The spread of the hollowing also affected the king's own mind. He began to see the want in everyone around him. He saw the desperation in the eyes of his citizens and the hunger in the eyes of his queen. The kingdom was becoming a place of scavengers. The order and structure he had spent his life building were being reclaimed by the greyness of the dark. This was the moment the king's confidence broke. He realized that he had spent his life building a sandcastle while the tide was coming in. The age of men wasn't failing because of a lack of effort. It was failing because it was built on a lie that the gods had told eons ago. Ultimately, the curse was the great equalizer. It didn't care if you were a peasant in the gutter or a king on a throne. It claimed everyone. The sight of his kingdom hollowing out was the psychological death of Vendrick. He became a recluse, hiding away in the depths of his castle, listening to the reports of his failing borders. He was no longer the conqueror. He was the custodian of a funeral. The dark sign was the final proof that his victory over the giants had been for nothing. He had stolen their power to build a kingdom, but that power couldn't save a single human soul from the inevitability of the dark. As the curse weakened the central authority of Drangleic, Vendrick's carefully constructed alliances began to shatter. One of the most significant fractures was the fall of the old Iron King, a neighboring ruler who had once been a peer to Vendrick. The Iron King was a man of similar ambition, but his hubris led him down an even more destructive path. He had built his own empire on the backs of the labor of the cursed, using iron and fire to dominate the land. But as the curse took hold, his kingdom sank into the molten earth, and he himself was transformed into a demonic creature of Icarus earth. His fall was a terrifying omen for Vendrick. It showed that even the most powerful rulers were susceptible to the rot. The collapse of the Iron King's realm created a power vacuum that further destabilized Drangleic. Other lords and minor kings, seeing the central crown's inability to stop the hollowing, began to rebel or retreat into their own madness. The empire of Drangleic was becoming a collection of isolated, dying fortresses. Vendrick found himself ruling over a map of ruins. The creeping influence of the curse wasn't just a biological threat, it was a political one. It eroded the trust between the king and his vassals. Everyone was looking for someone to blame, and many pointed their fingers at the king who had brought the giant's curse back from across the sea. Vendrick watched as his peers fell one by one. He saw the decay of the sunken king's city and the madness of the Ivory King in the north. He realized that he was the last man standing in a world of ghosts. The alliances he had forged through strength and diplomacy were now meaningless. There was no one left to trade with, no one left to consult, and no one left to fight but the Hollows. This isolation fed into Vendrick's growing sense of futility. He was a king without a kingdom, she a leader without followers. The age of men had turned into an age of solitary monsters, each clinging to a scrap of their former glory as they dissolved into the dark. The fractured alliances also meant that Vendrick was losing the buffer states that protected Drangleic from the outside world. The kingdom was now exposed on all sides. The dark wasn't just coming from the abyss. It was coming from the broken neighbors who had once been friends. The old Iron King's transformation into a demon was a physical representation of the corruption that was taking hold of the entire world. It was a reminder that when humans try to hold on to power in a dying age, they eventually stop being human. Vendrick saw his own potential future in the Iron King's fate, and it terrified him. He didn't want to become a monster. He wanted to remain a king, even if there was nothing left to rule. The fall of the other kings proved that Vendrick's centralized model of power was just as vulnerable as any other. He had thought that by gathering all the great souls in one place, he could protect the world. Instead, he had just created a single, massive target for the curse. The fractured alliances were the limbs of the kingdom falling off, leaving the head, Drangleic Castle, totally alone. Vendrick was witnessing the end of civilization itself, a slow-motion collapse where every pillar of society was crumbling under the weight of an ancient, inevitable law. He was the last sovereign of a dead world. Part 13. The Lost Bastille and the Containment of the Curse. In his final attempts to save the idea of Drangleic, Vendrick turned to a policy of cruel mercy. He realized that he couldn't cure the curse, so he decided to contain it. He began a massive program of exile, rounding up the undead and shipping them away to the Lost Bastille, a massive isolated prison built on a jagged rock in the middle of the ocean. He hoped that by removing the sick from the healthy, he could preserve the core of his kingdom. He convinced himself that this was a necessary sacrifice, a way to keep the rot from spreading to the heart of Drangleic Castle. He rebranded the undead as sinners or outcasts, dehumanizing his own people once again to justify their imprisonment. The Lost Bastille became a place of unimaginable suffering. Thousands of people were packed into cramped cells, left to hollow in the dark while the pursuers and the ruin sentinels stood guard. This was Vendrick at his most desperate and his most tyrannical. He was no longer building a kingdom of prosperity. He was building a kingdom of cages. He was trying to lock away the inevitable. This policy showed how far the king had fallen from his original ideals. The man who wanted to build an age for men was now hunting men down like animals and throwing them into a hole in the sea. It was a tactical failure as much as a moral one. as the curse simply continued to appear within the clean populations of the castle. The Bastille was also the site of some of Aldia's most horrific experiments. Under the guise of finding a cure, the king's brother used the prisoners as raw material. They were subjected to rituals and soul manipulations that made the curse look like a blessing in comparison. Vendrick turned a blind eye to these atrocities because he was too busy trying to maintain the facade of order in the capital. The Lost Bastille represents the hidden cost of Drangleic's survival. It was the basement of the kingdom, filled with the things Vendrick didn't want to look at. By exiling the undead, he wasn't solving the problem. He was just trying to hide it from his own conscience. This act of containment was the moment Vendrick lost the moral right to rule. He had betrayed the very people he had sworn to protect. The undead were not a foreign invasion. They were his own subjects, his own families. By treating them as a threat to be managed, he turned the kingdom into a police state. The irony is that the Lost Bastille eventually became more alive than Drangleic Castle itself, filled with the desperate, lingering memories of those who had been discarded. Vendrick had built a prison for his own failure, a monument to the fact that he was willing to sacrifice his humanity to save his crown. Ultimately, the Lost Bastille proved that you cannot contain the dark. It is like trying to hold back the tide with a net. The more people Vendrick sent away, the more people in Drangleic began to show the sign. The cruel mercy of the king only succeeded in creating a legacy of bitterness and resentment. When you visit the Bastille as the bearer of the curse, you aren't just visiting a prison. You're visiting the scene of a king's spiritual collapse. It is a cold, lonely place that serves as a reminder that the age of men ended not with a bang, but with the sound of 1,000 prison doors clicking shut. Part 14. Shrine of Amana and the Silence of Faith. Beneath the political and military structures of Drangleic lay the Shrine of Amana, a subterranean water temple that served as the kingdom's spiritual lungs. Here, the Milfanito, the singers, were tasked with an eternal duty to sing a song that would soothe the little ones, fireflies, and bring comfort to the undead. This was Vendrick's other attempt at a solution, a spiritual containment. He realized that since he couldn't cure the hollowing, he could at least dull the pain. The Shrine of Amana was a place of extreme beauty and extreme sorrow, where the silence of faith was replaced by a haunting, repetitive melody that kept the hollows from completely losing their minds. The Milfanito were creatures of pure, mournful purpose. They didn't know why they sang, and only that they must. Vendrick had essentially weaponized comfort to keep the dying from revolting. The shrine was a buffer zone between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a place where the truth of the curse was buried under layers of ritual and water. This showed that Vendrick's only cures were temporary comforts, not real solutions. He was treating the symptoms of a dying world because he had given up on finding a cure for the disease. The Shrine of Amana was a beautiful bandage on a mortal wound. As the kingdom collapsed, even the shrine began to rot. The singers were hunted by the followers of the Abyss, and the water became infested with the Archdrake sect and the lizard men who had lost their humanity. The silence of faith refers to the fact that the old gods were gone. And the new faith of Drangleic was just a way to manage despair. Vendrick had no gods to turn to, so he tried to manufacture his own divinity through the Milfanito. But a song cannot hold back the dark sign forever. Eventually, the singers would tire, the fireflies would die, and the hollows would wake up to the reality of their existence. The Shrine of Amana also served as a physical barrier to the undead crypt. Vendrick placed his most sensitive spiritual assets in this flooded corridor to protect his final retreat. It was a place of transition. To get to the king, one had to pass through the song, facing the seductive, hypnotic pull of the dark. This suggests that Vendrick understood that the only peace left in his kingdom was the peace of the grave, and he had given up on the light of the sun and was looking for a way to make the darkness bearable. He was a king who had moved from the golden age of the castle to the twilight of the shrine. Amana represents the failure of religion and spirituality in the face of the curse. In the first game, faith was a source of power, miracles. In the second, faith is just a lullaby for the dying. Vendrick's use of the Milfinito was a final act of pity for a people he had failed. He couldn't give them a future, so he gave them a song. It is one of the most melancholy locations in the game because it shows a king who has accepted defeat and is simply trying to make the end as painless as possible. The shrine is a monument to the silence that follows when a kingdom realizes its gods have abandoned it. Part 15. Raime's Exile and the Fall of the King's Knights. The internal rot of Drangleic reached its breaking point with the exile of Raime, the rebel. As the kingdom spiraled into darkness and Nashandra's influence grew, Raime was the only one in the king's inner circle who refused to stay silent. He saw through the queen's manipulation and realized that the giant's kinship and the golems were leading the king toward a catastrophe. He confronted Vendrick directly, warning him that his love for Nashandra was blinding him to the truth. But Vendrick, already deep in the grip of his obsession and the creeping hollowing, saw Raime's honesty as a betrayal. Under the subtle prodding of Nashandra, the king branded his most loyal skeptic a traitor and cast him out. This was a fatal blow to the king's military and moral foundation. Raime was the only one who could have acted as a check on Vendrick's hubris. His exile left the Aegis, Velstadt, as the king's sole primary advisor. Velstadt's blind loyalty meant that he would never question the king's descent into madness. The fall of the king's knights refers to this loss of balance. Without the rebel, the Aegis was just a shield for a dying lie. The two knights fought a duel that Raime lost, stripping him of his armor and his dignity. Raime fled to the Broom Tower in search of a different kind of power, eventually being consumed by the smoke of Nadalia. With Raime gone, the rest of the king's knights began to lose their way. Some followed the king into the dark, others hollowed in the field, and many simply abandoned their posts. The loyal knights of Drangleic were becoming a memory. Vendrick's military, which had once conquered the four great ones, was now a fractured, leaderless mess. The king's decision to choose the comforting lie of Nashandra over the harsh truth of Raime was the moment he officially surrendered his sovereignty. He was no longer a leader of men. He was a husband of the dark. The exile of Raime was the final crack in the kingdom's armor. The tragedy of Raime and Velstadt is the tragedy of Drangleic itself. Two great men who should have saved the kingdom were instead pitted against each other by a queen who wanted them both gone. Raime's rebellion was actually the highest form of loyalty, telling the king what he needed to hear, not what he wanted to hear. By silencing that voice, Vendrick ensured that no one would be left to stop him when he made his final, disastrous decisions. The king's inner circle was now a hollow echo, filled only with the clanking of Velstadt's gold armor and the whispers of the abyss. Raime's exile proved that Vendrick was no longer capable of objective thought. He had let his personal feelings for Nashandra override the safety of his realm. The rebel knight would eventually find a new master in the dark, becoming the Fume Knight, a being of pure, resentful strength. His story is a warning that when a king drives away his truth-tellers, he is left only with his ghosts. Raime's absence left a hole in the heart of the kingdom that could never be filled, and it set the stage for the final, lonely collapse of the king's will. As the kingdom fell apart, Aldia's research shifted from the study of souls to a desperate, horrific obsession with the first sin. Aldia was the first to truly articulate what was wrong with the world. He realized that the Age of Fire was an artificial state, forced into existence by Gwyn's original sacrifice. He saw that the first sin was the act of linking the fire, which bound humanity to a soul-farming cycle that was never meant to be. This realization drove Aldia into a state of enlightened madness. He began a series of experiments that would shame the gods, trying to find a way for a human to exist outside the cycle of light and dark. Aldia's experiments were a nightmare of biological and spiritual transgression. He tried to combine the souls of humans, giants, and dragons to create a perfect being that was immune to the curse. He created the ancient dragon at the top of the dragon shrine, a massive, artificial beast that was meant to be a symbol of transcendence. He transformed himself into a mass of burning, sentient biomass, sacrificing his humanity to become a scholar of the truth. He was trying to find a third path, a way to exist that wasn't dependent on the flickering of a flame. Vendrick watched his brother transform into a monster, but he couldn't stop him because he secretly hoped Aldia was right. The first sin was the revelation that destroyed the brothers' world. It meant that Drangleic and every kingdom before it was a lie. They were all just fuel for a dying fire. Aldia's research proved that hollowing was actually the natural state of humanity, and that the human form was just a mask imposed by the gods. This was a crushing blow to Vendrick. He had spent his life trying to be a great king for a race that was essentially a collection of shadows wearing clothes. The sin of the gods had doomed humanity to an eternity of trying to stay human in a world that didn't want them to be. Aldia became a voice that spoke from the shadows, challenging Vendrick to look at the truth. He no longer cared about the kingdom, he cared about the path. He became a mentor to the bearer of the curse, but to Vendrick, he was a reminder of his own failure. Aldia had transcended the curse by becoming something horrific, while Vendrick was still trying to be a king. The experiments in the manor were the final exam of the human era, and the results were devastating. They proved that there was no cure within the system. To be free, one had to break the system entirely. Ultimately, Aldia's experiments represent the peak of human intellectual arrogance and its inevitable collapse into despair. He found the truth, but the truth was too heavy for anyone to carry. The first sin is the anchor that keeps the world of Dark Souls 2 in a state of perpetual misery. By identifying it, Aldia gave Vendrick the ultimate doubt. He made the king realize that every war he had fought and every castle he had built was just another layer of the gods' grand deception. The two brothers had looked into the sun and seen the void behind it, and it was a sight that neither of them would ever recover from. Part 17. Vendrick learns the truth of the cycle. The transformation from an ambitious conqueror to a weary philosopher began the moment Vendrick looked past the borders of his kingdom and into the fundamental engine of time itself. Through his dialogues with Aldia and his own deep, solitary meditation on the great souls he possessed, he arrived at a crushing realization that rendered his life's work meaningless. The Age of Fire was not a period of history, but a recurring, stagnant trap. He saw that the world did not move forward toward a human future. It spun in a recursive circle. Every achievement, every castle, and every human life was merely kindling for a flame that was destined to die, only to be rekindled by a new sacrifice. This was the cosmic machinery of Gwyn, still turning long after the gods had abandoned their thrones. King Vendrick understood that he was not a sovereign of a new era, but a pawn in an ancient game designed to farm human souls to stave off the natural progression of the world into the Age of Dark. This epiphany stripped away the pride Vendrick took in his conquests. He saw that the great strength he had sought from the four Great Ones was nothing more than a weight intended to pull him toward the kiln of the first flame. The realization was a slow-motion collapse of his entire worldview. He had believed he was building a masterpiece of human agency, yet he discovered he was merely filling a reservoir for a flame that cared nothing for his people or their dreams. The cycle demanded a true monarch, not to lead a thriving civilization, but to serve as a high-quality battery for an artificial light. This truth turned his golden halls into a gilded cage, and his crown into a brand. He began to see the dark sign, not as a curse arriving from the outside, but as the natural state of humanity asserting itself against the artificial light imposed by the gods eons ago. The weight of this knowledge brought a profound, heavy silence to the king's private chambers. He stopped planning for the expansion of Drangleic because he realized there was no future to expand into, only a mindless repetition of the past. He looked at the history of the lands that existed before his, ancient civilizations like Haida or Alken, and saw the same pattern of rise and inevitable ruin. He was living in a graveyard of empires that had all tried and failed to do exactly what he was doing. This understanding shattered his resolve as a statesman. He became a man paralyzed by perspective, unable to justify further struggle when the outcome was already written in the fading embers of the world. He was a king who had finally looked behind the curtain of the universe and found that there was no one at the controls, only a mindless, hungry flame that demanded everything. Furthermore, Vendrick realized that the humanity he sought to preserve was itself a byproduct of this deception. According to the research he shared with Aldia, the physical form of man was a mask, a fleeting form created by the fire to hide the true, abyssal nature of the soul. To be human was to be under the influence of the gods' magic. To be hollow was to be free of that magic. This was a devastating blow to a man who prided himself on his human kingdom. He realized that by fighting the curse, he was actually fighting for the very chains that kept his race in servitude. Every miracle and every blessing was a tether to a system that thrived on human suffering. His entire moral framework, based on the protection of his subjects' humanity, was revealed to be a defense of a lie. Finally, this knowledge of the cycle changed his relationship with his own soul. He no longer saw his power as a gift, but as a burden that marked him for consumption. He looked at his brother, Aldia, who was already descending into the madness of physical transformation, and saw the only other person who truly understood the horror of their situation. Together, they realized that the Age of Fire was a parasite that fed on the strongest among them. Vendrick's greatness was his death sentence. The more he achieved, the more attractive he became to the flame. This understanding was the birth of his great doubt, the seed that would eventually grow into his decision to walk away from everything he had built, leaving a kingdom to rot rather than feeding it to the fire. Part 18. Why Vendrick refused to link the fire. Armed with the devastating knowledge of the first sin, Vendrick made a decision that set him apart from every monarch who had preceded him. He refused to link the fire. He looked at the throne of want and saw it for what it truly was, not a seat of power, but the door to a furnace. He understood that by throwing himself into the flame, he would only be extending a period of global stagnation and preventing the world from reaching its natural conclusion. He chose to walk away, not out of cowardice or a lack of strength, but as an act of ultimate rebellion against the gods' design. He would not be the next Gwyn. He would not sacrifice his soul to maintain a lie that only resulted in more cycles of hollowing and despair. By refusing the throne, he was attempting to force the cycle to break through sheer inaction. This refusal was a moment of terrifying, crystalline clarity for the king. Vendrick knew that by not linking the fire, he was consigning Drangleic to the full weight of the curse. He was choosing the dark because he believed the light was a parasitic, unnatural force. He hoped that by allowing the fire to fade completely, something new might finally emerge, a true age of men that wasn't dependent on the recycled souls of the old world. It was a gamble of apocalyptic proportions, and he knew he would be remembered as a failure for it. He sacrificed his reputation, his legacy, and his very sanity to stand as a barrier against the cycle. He became a king who would not be king, a man who held all the keys to the universe but refused to turn them, hoping the lock would simply rust away. However, this choice left Vendrick and his kingdom in a state of permanent, agonizing limbo. He couldn't move forward into a new age because the fire refused to go out entirely, and he wouldn't go back to the old one because he refused to feed it. His refusal created a vacuum of power that the universe and the ever-watchful Nashandra desperately sought to fill. He was a man standing in the doorway of destiny, blocking the exit but refusing to leave himself. This stalemate is the defining atmosphere of Drangleic in the game. The world is stuck because its most powerful occupant decided to stop playing his assigned part. Vendrick's refusal was a revolutionary act, but it was also a deeply lonely one that required him to watch his people suffer without the comfort of the flame. As he contemplated this refusal, Vendrick had to contend with the internal pressure of his own want. Every instinct in his body, reinforced by his great soul, urged him to claim the throne and solidify his divinity. The fire calls to the powerful, promising them a legacy of light in exchange for their life. Vendrick had to fight his own biology to walk away. He had to suppress his ego and his desire for immortality to allow the world to die. This internal conflict was as exhausting as any physical battle he had ever fought. It was a war against the very concept of the chosen undead. He decided that it was better to be a hollowed failure who told the truth than a burning god who lived a lie. Ultimately, Vendrick's refusal to link the fire was the first time a human monarch had looked at the sacrifice of the gods and said no. He recognized that the fire didn't save humanity, it only managed it. By walking away, he was trying to give humanity back its right to fade. He didn't have a map for what lay beyond the fire, but he knew that anything was better than the eternal, repeating nightmare of the cycle. This was the moment he stopped being a king of Drangleic and became a king of the dark. He accepted that his name would be forgotten and his castle would crumble, as long as he could keep his soul out of the fire's reach. Part 19. Nashandra's true nature revealed. As Vendrick withdrew from the false promise of the light, the shadows around him began to take a more definite and terrifying shape. He finally looked at his queen, not through the eyes of a devoted lover, but through the eyes of a man who had seen the depths of the abyss. He realized that Nashandra was not a woman from a distant land at all, but a fragment of Manus, a tiny sentient shard of the primeval abyss that had survived the ages. She was the smallest and weakest of the shards, and because of that, her want was the most insatiable. She didn't love Vendrick for his character. She loved the proximity to his great soul and the access it provided to the throne. She had used him as a sophisticated tool to gather the power she needed to reach the first flame. The revelation was a visceral, psychological horror for the king. Vendrick realized that his queen of beauty was a metaphysical predator that had been feeding on his ambitions and his vulnerabilities for years. Every word of wisdom she had whispered into his ear, every warning she had given about the looming threat of the giants, was a calculated step to lead him toward a specific conclusion. She wanted the giant's kinship, the ability to command the golems and bypass the seals of the kiln, so she could claim the first flame and usher in an age of pure, abyssal dark. She was waiting for him to either become weak enough for her to consume, or for him to open the door so she could slip inside. The king saw the void within her and understood that he had invited the end of the world into his own bed. This realization turned his heart to stone and his memories to ash. He saw that his entire marriage was a campaign of psychological warfare, a long con played by a creature that didn't even possess a human heart. Nashandra had played on his deepest insecurities, his fatherly instincts, and his desire to be a savior to turn him into a thief and a conqueror. He felt the coldness of the abyss emanating from her, a hunger that could never be satisfied no matter how many souls he provided. The tragedy was that he still felt a lingering, painful affection for the mask she wore, even as he looked at the black soul beneath. He was trapped in a relationship with a parasite that was now essential to his own identity. Furthermore, he understood that Nashandra's want was a mirror of his own. She was only able to manipulate him because he wanted things. He wanted a legacy, he wanted to be loved, and he wanted to save his kingdom. She was the shadow cast by his own ego. This made the betrayal even more personal. He wasn't just a victim of an external monster. He was a victim of his own desires made flesh. Nashandra was the personification of the very rot he was trying to fight. By marrying her, he had effectively wedded his kingdom to the abyss. He realized that every act of protection he had performed under her guidance was actually an act of preparation for her final ascension. Finally, instead of fighting her in an open conflict, which he feared he might lose given her influence over the castle and his own heart, he began to plan his escape. He realized that the only way to beat a creature of want was to take away the object of that desire. He would not give her the satisfaction of a duel or a confrontation. He would simply vanish, taking the keys to the world with him. This realization was the final break in his mind. He was a man who had been betrayed by the gods through the cycle and by his wife through the abyss. He was left with nothing but his own fading will and a desperate plan to bury his power where neither the fire nor the dark could find it. Part 20. The king realizes he has been manipulated. The final, crushing piece of the tragedy fell into place when Vendrick connected the dots between his queen's whispers and the destruction of the giants. He realized that the giant war, the conflict that had cost thousands of lives, scorched his lands and doomed his people to the retaliatory curse, was a completely manufactured crisis. Nashandra had sent him across the sea not to protect Drangleic from a looming threat, but to provoke the giants and steal their essential power for her own ends. He had been a puppet for a fragment of the abyss, acting out a script of conquest that served no one but her. The great strength he brought back from the sea was the very thing she needed to bypass the ancient defenses of the throne. The horror of this realization was absolute and paralyzing. Vendrick saw that he had committed genocide and destroyed his own moral standing for a lie told by a shadow in a dress. He looked at the golems that lined the halls of his castle and saw not his pride or his engineering brilliance, but his absolute shame. Every massive stone they moved was a testament to his gullibility and his weakness. The age of men he had dreamed of was actually the age of Nashandra, a period of history where he had served as the physical muscle for the Dark's ambition. He was a king who had been outmaneuvered by his own heart, a man who had traded the souls of an entire race for a queen's approval. This understanding came far too late to save the kingdom or the people he loved. The giants had already retaliated, the land was already dying, and the dark sign was already blooming across the flesh of his subjects. Vendrick saw that he had been the architect of his own destruction, meticulously guided by the hand of the person he trusted most in the world. He realized that the curse was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of his own interference with the natural order. He had invited the chaos into his home because he was too arrogant to believe he could be fooled. This realization broke his spirit in a way that no physical hollowing ever could, turning his inner life into a desert of regret. Moreover, he realized that his brother Aldia had been right to be skeptical of the queen from the beginning. He remembered the warnings he had ignored and the advisors he had silenced, like Raime, who had seen the truth he was too blind to acknowledge. The guilt of these betrayals added to the weight of his crown. He had exiled his most loyal friends to protect a monster. This isolation was Nashandra's greatest weapon. She had stripped him of everyone who could have saved him, leaving him alone with her in a castle built of stolen souls. He was a master of reality who had lived in a complete fantasy for decades. Finally, the quiet horror of understanding his own role in the apocalypse was the final weight that pushed him toward the decision to flee. He couldn't stay and rule a kingdom that was a monument to his own stupidity. He couldn't look his subjects in the eye, knowing he was the one who had brought the giants' wrath upon them. His retreat was an act of profound self-loathing. He didn't flee to the crypt to hide from the world. He fled to hide from himself. He couldn't bear to see the face of the man who had burned a world for a ghost. The kingly identity he had cultivated, the true monarch, was revealed to be a costume worn by a fool. He was a giant who had been led by a leash held by a shard of darkness. Section 5. Retreat and Ruin. Chapter 21. Drangleic Abandoned. When the weight of the truth became physically and spiritually unbearable, Vendrick made his final move. He abandoned his throne and his people. He realized that as long as he stayed in the castle, Nashandra would eventually find a way to use him to open the path to the fire. In an act of strategic self-destruction, he took his king's ring, the only key capable of opening the gates to the throne of want and the Shrine of Amana, and vanished into the night. He left the castle without a word of explanation to his subjects, leaving his chancellor and his remaining knights to oversee a ghost ship. The kingdom of Drangleic didn't fall to an invading army. It fell to the silence of a king who had simply given up. The abandonment of the castle was the final death knell for Drangleic's social and political structure. Without Vendrick's presence and the stabilizing influence of the souls he provided, the infrastructure of the realm began to freeze into a state of permanent decay. The fires in the hearths went out, and the complex bureaucracy of the state dissolved into primal chaos and hollowing. the castle became a tomb of memory, where the golems stood frozen in place, waiting for a command that would never come. Vendrick's retreat was a form of scorched earth policy. He was starving Nashandra of the one thing she needed, his physical presence and the key he carried. By taking the ring and fleeing to the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the world, he was burying the future in the dark. This period marked the beginning of the long silence that the player encounters in the game. The streets of the capital, once bustling with the trade and energy of a golden age, were now filled only with the wind and the mindless shuffling of those who had lost their minds to the curse. The king's absence created a spiritual vacuum that allowed the elements and the abyss to reclaim the stones. Rain and moss began to eat away at the spires of the castle, and the grand halls became corridors of shadow. Vendrick had decided that a dead, silent kingdom was safer for the world than a kingdom ruled by the abyss. He chose to let his empire rot in the rain, rather than let it serve as the bridge to Nashandra's dark ascension. Furthermore, the abandonment was an act of profound betrayal to the common people. They had looked to Vendrick as their protector, the man who had ended the chaos of the old ones and brought order to the land. When he left, he didn't just take a ring, he took their hope. He left them to hollow in the streets while he sought his own private peace in the dark. This is the moral complexity of Vendrick. His act of saving the world from Nashandra was also the act that doomed his subjects to a slow, agonizing death without leadership. He was a king who chose the cosmic over the personal, proving that even a good king is capable of monstrous neglect when faced with the end of the world. Finally, the castle without its king became a physical representation of a mind without a soul. It was a beautiful, empty shell, still standing but devoid of purpose. Nashandra remained in the throne room, a queen of nothing, waiting for a bearer of the curse to arrive and do the work that Vendrick refused to do. The abandonment was the moment. The age of men became the age of ghosts. Vendrick had succeeded in stopping the queen, but the cost was the total annihilation of his civilization's spirit. He walked into the fog of the past, leaving the present to burn out slowly and quietly in his absence. Part 22. The Soldiers Who Turned to Stone. As the king's influence faded and the souls he provided to the kingdom's infrastructure began to leak away, the military that had once dominated the continent underwent a strange, poetic transformation. Without the soul fire of the monarch to sustain their purpose, many of the royal swordsmen and the elite guardians of the castle began to calcify. They literally turned into stone statues, frozen in the very positions they occupied when the king's will finally left the castle. In the halls of Drangleic Castle and the long, rain-slicked passages of the King's Passage, the player finds these silent, grey sentinels. They aren't dead, but they are trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a soul to jumpstart their machinery. This transformation was not just a physical phenomenon, but a symbolic one that reflected the petrification of the kingdom's heart. Drangleic had become a place where time no longer moved forward, but merely vibrated in place. The soldiers became part of the architecture, monuments to a war that had no end and a king who had no destination. This was the result of the stolen power of the giants coming full circle. The soul arts that had been used to build the golems were now claiming the humans who had relied on them. The boundary between living flesh and cold, inanimate stone had dissolved, leaving behind a landscape of statues that stood as a warning to any traveler. For the soldiers who didn't turn to stone, the fate was arguably even worse. They became the mindless hollows that roam the ruins. They continued to perform their military duties out of pure muscle memory, guarding empty doorways and patrolling silent battlements for enemies that had been dead for centuries. They had forgotten who they were guarding or why they were fighting, but the want of the soul kept their bodies moving in a parody of life. This created a kingdom of mindless clockwork, a place where the rituals of war and governance continued long after the meaning had vanished. The stone soldiers and the hollowed knights are the two sides of Vendrick's failure, one frozen in the past, the other rotting in the present. The presence of these stone soldiers creates a feeling of intense, claustrophobic dread. They represent the loss of agency that defines the end of an age. These men were once individuals with names, families, and loyalty to a king they believed in. Now they are just obstacles, frozen in an eternal moment of failure. When the player strikes them and they awaken, it isn't a return to life, but a brief, violent spasm of a soul that has been trapped in a cage of rock. They are the physical evidence of Vendrick's decision to stop the world. By refusing to link the fire, and he forced his people into this state of living death, where they can neither move forward nor find the peace of the grave. Ultimately, the soldiers who turn to stone are the most literal manifestation of the stagnation of Drangleic. They are a kingdom that has been told to stay, and so they have stayed, long past the point of sanity. They reflect the king's own state of mind, a man who had become so heavy with the weight of his secrets that he could no longer move. The castle is filled with these statues, because the king's golden age was always an attempt to freeze time. In the end, he succeeded, but the result was not immortality. It was a graveyard where the headstones still breathe. Part 23. Velstadt's final loyalty. In the midst of this total social and physical collapse, one figure remained unshaken. Velstadt, the royal aegis. When Vendrick made the final decision to flee to the undead crypt, Velstadt did not question the logic of the move, nor did he seek to take the vacant throne for himself. He followed his master into the deepest darkness, taking up a final, eternal vigil at the door of the king's final chamber. Velstadt understood that the king was broken, and he understood that the queen was the ultimate threat to the world. His loyalty became a literal and metaphorical wall. He stood in the pitch-black corridors of the crypt for centuries, his gold armor slowly tarnishing in the damp, stagnant air, acting as the final barricade between Vendrick and the world. Velstadt's vigil is one of the most poignant and tragic examples of loyalty in the entire Dark Souls series. He knew that Vendrick would never return to the light. He knew that his master was slowly hollowing, losing the very soul that Velstadt had sworn his life to protect. Yet he stayed. He became a guardian of a secret, a knight protector of a man who was no longer there. He stood in the oppressive silence of the dead, listening to the drip of water and the distant, mournful singing of the Milfinito, holding his massive bell hammer ready for any intruder, including the queen herself. His presence in the crypt is the only reason Nashandra was unable to claim the king's ring for herself. As the ages passed in the darkness, even Velstadt began to be consumed by the very shadows he was guarding the king from. The oppressive atmosphere of the crypt seeped into his armor and his spirit, turning his holy miracles into corrupted dark hexes. He became a part of the very environment he was protecting the king from, a golden knight slowly turning into a creature of the abyss. This was the ultimate price of his devotion. He lost his own light to ensure that his master could hollow in peace. He represents the pure loyalty that Vendrick's kingdom was supposed to be built on. But in the end, that loyalty was only used to guard a grave and a failure. His relationship with the king during this time was one of silent, mutual despair. Vendrick, wandering in his chamber, likely didn't even recognize the man standing outside his door, but Velstadt's presence provided the only order left in the king's world. Velstadt became the last remnant of the Drangleic military, a single soldier holding a single door in a world that had already ended. He was the Aegis until the very end, she protecting the king not from death, but from being used by the dark. It is a form of love that is both beautiful and horrifying, as it required Velstadt to abandon his own humanity to serve a husk. Ultimately, Velstadt's final state is a mirror of the kingdom's own fate, greatness slowly being swallowed by a cold, indifferent dark. He is the last knight of a dead dream, standing at a door that leads to nothing but a wandering old man. When the player eventually defeats him, it is a mercy. It is the only way to release him from a duty that had become a prison. Velstadt's loyalty was the anchor that kept Vendrick's secret safe, but it was also the chain that kept both of them trapped in the dark for an eternity. He died as he lived, a shield for a king who had nothing left to protect. Part 24. Vendrick retreats to the Undead Crypt. Vendrick's final destination was the Undead Crypt, a place located at the absolute bottom of the world's geography, where the dead are sent to find a final peace away from the meddling of the sun. This was not a tactical retreat intended for a later comeback. It was a spiritual and literal burial. He chose the crypt because it was the only place where the lie of the gods could not reach. In the absolute darkness of the tombs, surrounded by the Nito-inspired Finito who guard the silence, Vendrick sought to strip himself of everything that made him a king. He wanted to be forgotten by history. He discarded his crown, his magnificent golden armor, and his massive sword, leaving them in a pile outside his circular chamber. The crypt represents the ultimate rejection of the Age of Fire and all its associated vanities. It is a place of rest, a place where the soul is allowed to settle and eventually fade into the dark. By retreating here, Vendrick was signaling to the universe that he was done with the struggle of the cycle. He was no longer trying to solve the curse or save the people. He was submitting to the inevitable. He spent his final conscious moments in that small, dark room, reflecting on the ruin he had caused and the brother he had lost to the madness of the manor. He was waiting for the hollowing to take him, hoping that in the void of his own mind, he would finally find the peace that had eluded him. This retreat was also his final, most effective act of protection for the world. By staying in the crypt, guarded by the formidable Velstadt and the Finito, he was keeping the keys to the throne of want, his ring and his kinship, out of the reach of the abyss. He was a sentinel of his own failure, a man who stayed in the dark so that the fire would not be misused by his queen. The tragedy of the Undead Crypt is that it is the most honest place in the entire kingdom. There is no pretense of glory, engineering, or progress there. There is only the cold, hard reality of the end. Vendrick, the man who built an empire, ended his journey as a naked, wandering ghost. The environment of the crypt itself, the rows of tombstones, the torches that must not be lit, and the singing that soothes the dead, provided the only comfort Vendrick could accept. He had become allergic to the light, seeing it as the source of all the manipulation and pain in his life. The darkness of the crypt was a mercy. It allowed him to dissolve slowly, his memories leaking away until he was just a hollowed shell pacing in a circle. He had moved from the highest, sun-drenched spire of Drangleic Castle to the deepest, most forgotten hole in the earth. It was a descent that mirrored his own loss of faith in the world he had created. Ultimately, Vendrick's time in the crypt is the final image of the human king. He is a reminder that in the world of Dark Souls 2, the only reward for wisdom is the realization of your own powerlessness. He stayed in that room for centuries, a giant man reduced to a mindless animal, while the world above him continued to rot in his absence. He held the key to the future in his withered hand, but he refused to use it, choosing instead to let the world wait for someone who could see a path that he couldn't. His retreat was the ultimate sacrifice. He gave up his mind and his dignity to ensure that the want of the abyss would never win. Part 25. The Hollowing of King Vendrick. The process of hollowing is often described as a slow erosion of the self, but for a man of Vendrick's spiritual density, it was a tectonic collapse. In the suffocating darkness of the undead crypt, the king began the final transition from a thinking being to a mindless husk. Having stripped away his armor, his crown, and his sword, he removed the external anchors of his identity. Without the weight of the throne or the gaze of his subjects, the memories of his life began to leak out into the stagnant air. He forgot the names of the 4 great ones he had conquered. He forgot the layout of the castle he had built. Eventually, he even forgot the face of the brother who had warned him and the queen who had betrayed him. He was becoming a hollow in the most literal sense. A vessel that had been emptied of its purpose and its history. This hollowing was not an accident, but a choice. By allowing himself to lose his mind, Vendrick was performing one final act of sabotage against Nashandra. A hollowed mind cannot be manipulated. A man who does not know who he is cannot be coerced into opening the path to the throne of want. He retreated into a state of primal existence, pacing in a never-ending circle within his stone chamber. His physical body, once a towering symbol of human potential, became a gaunt, grey relic. His skin turned to the colour of ash, and his eyes lost the spark of the great soul. He became a ghost inhabiting his own flesh, a king who had successfully hidden the keys to the world within the vault of his own madness. The tragedy of this state is seen in the way he wanders. When the player finally encounters him, Vendrick does not attack. He does not speak. He simply shuffles in the dark, dragging his heels through the dust of the crypt. He is a giant reduced to a shadow. This is the ultimate human end in the world of Dark Souls 2. Even the strongest man who ever lived, the one who rivaled the gods, could not escape the fundamental law of the dark sign. His hollowing is a reminder that the age of men was always a fragile dream. In the end, the king who lost everything even lost the memory of what he had lost. He became a silent inhabitant of the dark, a guardian who had forgotten what he was guarding. Furthermore, the hollowing of Vendrick served as a cosmic shield, because he was no longer conscious in the way the fire or the abyss required, but he became a dead end for the cycle. He was the true monarch who had broken his own crown. This state of living death was his final fortress. As long as he remained a mindless beast in the crypt, the queen remained a queen of nothing. He sacrificed his intellect, his dignity, and his very soul to ensure that the want of the abyss would find no purchase. It was a cold, miserable victory that required him to spend centuries in a lightless room, waiting for a stranger to come and end his misery. The image of the hollowed king is the most powerful image of failure in the series. It shows that power, without a way to break the cycle, is just a slower path to the same destination. Vendrick's hollowing was the final chapter of Drangleic's history, a silent closing of the book. He was the man who had the strength to take the world, but only the wisdom to leave it. His pacing in the crypt is the heartbeat of a dead kingdom, a rhythmic reminder that in the face of the first sin, even the greatest among us will eventually be reduced to a shadow wandering in the dark. Section 6. The King in Memory. Part 26. Entering the Memory of the King. The player's journey into the heart of Vendrick's story takes a supernatural turn with the acquisition of the Ashen Mist Heart. By presenting this artifact to the discarded pile of Vendrick's armor in the Undead Crypt, the player is able to transcend time and enter the memory of the king. This is not a physical place, but a manifestation of the king's soul before the hollowing was complete. Here, in a space that exists outside the decay of the world, we encounter Vendrick as he truly was, a weary and colossal philosopher king. He is no longer the mindless beast we see pacing in the crypt, but a man of immense gravity and sorrow, standing at the edge of his own extinction. Entering the memory allows the player to bypass the silence of the present and hear the why behind the king's actions. In this realm of mist and memory, Vendrick speaks with a voice that is heavy with the weight of eons. He is aware of his own fate and the fate of his kingdom. He looks upon the player not as an intruder, but as a potential successor, a next monarch. This interaction is the emotional core of the game, as it provides the context for every tragedy we have witnessed. We see the man behind the myth, a leader who was brave enough to admit he was wrong and strong enough to try to find another way. The memory is a space of pure reflection. Vendrick uses this opportunity to impart the hard-won lessons of his reign. He speaks of the nature of the soul, the lie of the fire, and the inevitability of the dark. This is the only moment in the game where we see the true monarch in his full intellectual capacity. He isn't interested in gold or conquest anymore. He is interested in the path. He challenges the player to see beyond the duality of light and dark, urging them to find a strength that doesn't depend on the god's cycle. The memory is a bridge between the failure of the past and the possibility of the future. The experience of being in the king's memory highlights the tragedy of his isolation. Even in his own mind, Vendrick is alone. There are no knights, no queen, and no brother, only the heavy grey fog of his thoughts. This reflects how far he had retreated from the world, even before he fled to the crypt. He had already become a ghost in his own life. By speaking to him here, the player is witnessing the final sparks of a dying sun. It is a moment of profound intimacy with a legendary figure, allowing us to see that his greatest strength was not his sword, but his capacity to endure the truth. Ultimately, entering the memory is the moment the player stops being a mere scavenger and starts being a student of the king. Vendrick's words provide the blessing of perspective. He reveals that the throne is not a prize, but a responsibility that he himself was unable to fulfill. By sharing his memory, he is passing the torch of his doubt to the player, hoping that we have the resolve to succeed where he failed. The memory is the last testament of a man who realized that the only way to save the world was to let the old one die and start again with a clearer vision. Part 27. Vendrick's final words on light and dark. In the quiet depths of his memory, Vendrick delivers a philosophical treatise that redefines the player's understanding of the Dark Souls universe. He speaks of light and dark not as opposing forces of good and evil, but as two sides of the same coin, a coin that the gods have been flipping for eternity. Dark is the bloom of the soul, he tells us, suggesting that the darkness people fear is actually the true, untapped potential of humanity. He realizes that the fear of the dark was a tool used by Gwyn to keep humans tethered to the fire. Vendrick's final philosophy is one of integration. He believes a true monarch must embrace both the flame and the shadow to truly understand the world. This perspective was a radical departure from the religious dogmas of the time. Vendrick explains that the fire is a fleeting dream, a temporary mask of order placed over the eternal, chaotic reality of the dark. He warns the player that to seek the fire is to seek a lie, but to embrace the dark without understanding is to lose oneself. He envisions a true monarch as someone who can stand in the middle, someone who can walk the path of the human without being consumed by either extreme. This is his final challenge to the bearer of the curse, to transcend the binary choice of linking the fire or letting it die, and instead to find a third path that belongs to neither. His words on the soul are equally profound. He describes the soul as something that longs for its original state, which is the dark. This explains the want that drove Nashandra and the want that drives the player. We are all fragments of a whole that has been shattered by the gods. Vendrick realized that the cycle continues because we are always trying to fill the hole in our hearts with the light of the fire, not realizing that the hole is the dark, and the dark is where our strength lies. He speaks with the clarity of someone who has lost everything, and thus has nothing left to fear. His voice is the voice of humanity, finally waking up from a long, divine dream. Vendrick reflects on the futility of his own reign. He admits that he tried to build a kingdom of light while ignoring the shadow, and that this imbalance is what allowed Nashandra to take root. He realizes that a kingdom that denies its own nature is doomed to fail. His final words are a warning against the arrogance of great souls. He tells the player that power is a burden that blinds the eyes and hardens the heart. He encourages us to peer into the dark, to find the truth that lies beneath the surface of the world's illusions. He is a king who has finally found peace by accepting the very thing he spent his life fighting. Vendrick's final words are a legacy of intellectual liberation. He gives the player the permission to question the gods and the cycle. He frames the struggle not as a quest for glory, but as a quest for truth. By the time he finishes speaking, the throne of want looks less like a goal and more like a test. He leaves the player with a heavy question. Can you be the one to finally step out of the light and find a way to live in the true dark of humanity? His philosophy is the final gift of a failed king, a map to a destination that he himself was too late to reach. Part 28. The Crowns of the Ancient Kings. In his final years of lucidity, Vendrick became obsessed with a new goal: the collection and unification of the 4 crowns of the old kings. He realized that while he couldn't cure the world of the curse, there might be a way for an individual to resist its effects. He sought the crowns of the Sunken King, the Old Iron King, and the Ivory King, monarchs who had all, like him, attempted to build kingdoms in the face of the encroaching dark. Vendrick understood that these crowns were not just symbols of office. They were vessels of immense soul power that, when brought together, could potentially harmonize and create a shield against the hollowing process. The search for the crowns was Vendrick's last great project. He sent his knights and his own thoughts into the far corners of the world to locate these relics. He saw them as the shards of human sovereignty. Each crown represented a different aspect of the human struggle against the cycle: the struggle against poison and decay in Shulva, the struggle against fire and industry in the Broom Tower, and the struggle against the literal chaos of the abyss in Eleum Lois. Vendrick realized that by uniting these experiences, these kingships, one could find a strength that was greater than the sum of its parts. He was trying to distill the essence of what it meant to be a king of men. The collection of the crowns is the objective of the 3 DLC chapters, and it represents the player retracing Vendrick's intellectual footsteps. Each crown we recover is a piece of a puzzle that Vendrick had already solved in theory, but could never complete in practice. He was too weak, too hollowed, and too haunted to go and claim them himself. He left them as a trial for the next monarch. He wanted us to see the failures of the other kings so we could understand the magnitude of the task ahead. The crowns were meant to be the tools of transcendence, the physical equipment needed to survive a world without fire. Furthermore, Vendrick realized that the crowns held a secret blessing. He discovered that if someone with a sufficiently powerful soul, someone who had conquered the Great Ones, were to wear the united crowns, the dark sign would be temporarily held in check. This was the solution he had been looking for all along. It wasn't a cure for the world, but it was a cure for the monarch. It was a way to stay human, even when the fire died. This discovery was bittersweet. It was a path to personal salvation that came too late to save his people. He had found the key, but he was already too far gone to turn it in the lock. The crowns of the ancient kings represent Vendrick's final, desperate attempt to bequeath something meaningful to the future. He didn't want the next monarch to be a mindless fuel source for the flame. He wanted them to have the choice he never had, the ability to exist as a human in a world of shadows. The crowns are the physical manifestation of Vendrick's doubt, a rejection of the gods' terms in favor of a human-made miracle. By gathering them, the player is fulfilling Vendrick's last will and testament, becoming the King of Crowns, who can finally look the abyss in the eye without blinking. Part 29. The Blessing of the Crown. The culmination of the player's journey through the DLCs is the ritual in Vendrick's memory, where he bestows his blessing upon the gathered crowns. This is the moment where the player achieves what Vendrick could not. By bringing the crowns of the sunken iron and ivory kings to the memory of the King of Drangleic, a resonance is created. Vendrick, using the last of his spiritual strength, weaves the power of these disparate kingships into a single protective aura. From that point on, as long as the player wears one of the crowns, they will never hollow upon death. It is a moment of profound mechanical and narrative triumph. The curse is, for the first time, defeated for an individual. The blessing is a temporary cure for an individual, but a permanent statement against the cycle. It proves that human ingenuity and the great souls of men can overcome the first sin of the gods. Vendrick's blessing is his ultimate victory over Nashandra and the cycle. He has created a being, the player, who is no longer bound by the rules of the game. We are no longer a bearer of the curse in the traditional sense. We are something new. We are a monarch who can die and return with our memories and our humanity intact. This was Vendrick's final gift. The ability to maintain one's identity in a world that is designed to erase it. However, the tragedy of the blessing is its limited scope. Vendrick realized that this cure could not be scaled to the entire population. It required the souls of 4 kings and the direct intervention of a true monarch just to save one person. It is a solution for a hero, not a society. This is why Vendrick didn't celebrate his discovery. He shared it with a heavy heart. He knew that the people of Drangleic would still rot, and the world would still fade. The blessing is a mercy for the one, a way to ensure that the person who eventually decides the fate of the world does so with a clear human mind. Furthermore, the blessing represents the passing of the burden. By giving the player the power to resist hollowing, Vendrick is essentially saying, now you have no excuse. We can no longer blame the curse for our failures. We are now free to make a choice about the throne of want without the pressure of losing our minds. Vendrick has given us the autonomy he never had. He has removed the biological imperative of the cycle, leaving us with only the moral choice. This is the ultimate test of character. What will a man do when he can no longer be forced into submission by the fear of hollowing? Ultimately, the blessing of the crown is Vendrick's "I'm sorry" to the world. It is the best he could do with the wreckage of his life. It is a small, bright light in a vast, encroaching darkness. It allows the player to stand tall in the undead crypt, looking down at the hollowed remains of the king, and realize that we have surpassed him. We carry his blessing, his crowns, and his doubt. We are the finished version of the project he started eons ago. The blessing is the moment the Age of Men actually begins, not as a kingdom, but as a single, resolute individual who refuses to forget who they are. Part 30. What Vendrick tried to leave behind. As Vendrick faded into the total hollowing of the crypt, he left behind a trail of breadcrumbs for the next monarch. He didn't want to be the hero of the story. He wanted to be the architect of a better one. He left behind his ring, his armor, his sword, and his memory as a series of lessons. He wanted the next person who claimed his power to understand the cost of it. He didn't want another conqueror. He wanted a seeker. Everything in the game's second half is designed by Vendrick to test the player's resolve, and to ensure that only someone with a great soul and a clear mind could ever reach the throne of want. The things he left behind were meant to be a legacy for someone stronger than himself. He left the Milfinito to soothe the path. He left the Finito to guard the dead. He left Velstadt to act as the final gatekeeper. He was curating his own failure so it could become someone else's foundation. He understood that his own story was over, but he believed that the human story was still worth fighting for. By leaving his power scattered and guarded, he was ensuring that Nashandra would have to work for it, giving the next monarch time to emerge and grow strong enough to face her. His legacy was one of preparedness. He didn't leave a set of instructions on how to link the fire. He left a set of questions. He wanted us to see the ruin of Drangleic and ask ourselves if we really wanted to repeat it. He left the Emerald Herald as a guide, a creature born of his and Aldia's experiments, to lead the player toward the truth. Everything we interact with in the late game is a piece of Vendrick's final, desperate attempt to influence a future he would never see. He was a king who died to give the world one last chance to choose a different path. Furthermore, what he left behind was a new definition of monarchy. To Vendrick, a king was no longer someone who ruled over others, but someone who mastered themselves. He left behind the idea that the true monarch is the one who can look at the fire and the dark and say neither. He tried to leave behind a philosophy of transcendence. He wanted his successor to be the one who could finally break the script of the gods. This is why he is such a revered figure in the lore. He wasn't just a king who failed, he was a king who failed forward, creating the conditions for a victory he could never achieve. Ultimately, the tragedy of what Vendrick left behind is that it is all he could leave. He couldn't leave a thriving kingdom or a happy family. He could only leave his secrets, his shame, and a small hope for a stranger. He died a broken, hollowed old man, but he died having done everything in his power to protect the future from his own mistakes. He left behind a world that was ready to be changed, even if it was ready because it was already dead. His legacy is the bearer of the curse themselves, a being forged in the fires of his failure, ready to walk a path that the King of Drangleic could only imagine in his dreams. Section 7. The Throne of Want. Part 31. The Throne. Watcher and Defender. Before the player can even approach the Throne of Want, they must face its final guardians, the Throne Watcher and the Throne Defender. These two enigmatic figures represent the trial of the throne. They are the last line of defense, guarding the seat of ultimate power from anyone who is not worthy of the title of monarch. Unlike Velstadt, who was loyal to the man Vendrick, the Watcher and Defender are loyal to the position. They represent the cold, mechanical necessity of the cycle. They exist to ensure that whoever claims the throne has the great soul required to sustain the fire or usher in the dark. They are the physical manifestation of the world's demand for a decision. The Watcher and Defender are a study in contrast. She much like the dualities Vendrick struggled with. The Watcher is fast, agile, and clad in white, representing the light or the aspiration of the throne. The Defender is heavy, slow, and clad in dark armor, representing the dark or the protection of the status quo. Together, they represent a complete unit of sovereign power. They have stood in the depths of the Throne of Want for centuries, waiting for a candidate who can overcome their combined strength. To defeat them is to prove that one has the will to rule. They are the final exam of the monarch's journey, the gatekeepers of the destiny Vendrick walked away from. Their presence suggests that the Throne of Want has its own independent logic, separate from the king's wishes. Even though Vendrick abandoned the throne, these guardians remained. This highlights the unnatural nature of the cycle. The mechanism of the fire continues to operate even when the players have left the board. The Watcher and Defender are like clockwork soldiers, performing a duty that has outlived its purpose. They do not speak. They do not reason. They simply fight. They are the silence of power, the final obstacle that turns the quest for the throne into a ritual of violence. Furthermore, the battle with the Watcher and Defender is the moment the player finally steps into the vacuum left by Vendrick. By entering the throne room, we are officially declaring our candidacy for the crown. The Guardians recognize this and attempt to strike us down, not out of malice, but as a test of our want. They want to see if we are strong enough to hold the weight of the world. Their cooperative combat style, where one can revive the other, is a metaphor for the cycle itself, a constant, repeating struggle that refuses to end until a superior force intervenes. Ultimately, the Throne Watcher and Defender are the end of the road for the old world. They are the final remnants of the gods' security system. When they fall, the path to the first flame is finally open. But their defeat is also a moment of gravity. It means that there is no one left to stop us from making a mistake. We have bypassed the Guardians, but we have also bypassed the safety measures. We are now alone with the throne and the choice it represents. The death of the Guardians is the final bell tolling for the age of Drangleic, leaving the stage empty for the final act of the drama. Part 32. Nashandra's final move. As soon as the Throne Watcher and Defender are defeated, the final player in the tragedy makes her move. Nashandra, having waited in the shadows for centuries, finally reveals herself in her true, monstrous form. She did not follow us into the crypt or the memory. She simply waited at the finish line, letting us do the hard work of opening the path and defeating the Guardians. This is her final move. She intends to kill the player at the moment of our triumph, claiming the giant's kinship and the great soul we have gathered to finally access the throne of want for herself. She is the queen of want at the peak of her hunger, a being of pure abyss, ready to consume the last light in the world. Her transformation is a terrifying sight. The unparalleled beauty she once possessed is gone, replaced by a skeletal, dark entity draped in the remnants of her human form. She carries a scythe and radiates a curse aura that drains the life from anything nearby. This is the truth of what Vendrick was living with for years. She is a shard of Manus, a creature that thrives on the death of hope. Her final move is not just an attempt to take the throne, but an attempt to erase the legacy of Vendrick once and for all. She wants to be the one who finally wins the game that the gods and the humans have been playing for eons. The battle with Nashandra is the ultimate confrontation between the human will, the player, and the abyssal want, the queen. She represents the dark side of the cycle, the hunger that never ends. She is the personification of the very want that Vendrick warned us about in his memory. She doesn't have a plan for a better world. She only has a plan for more consumption. To defeat her is to finally excise the rot that has been at the heart of Drangleic since its inception. It is a battle for the soul of the world, fought in the shadow of the throne that she has spent her entire existence trying to claim. Furthermore, Nashandra's appearance here proves that she was never interested in the Link the Fire mission. She wanted the throne so she could use its power to usher in an era of pure, unmanaged dark. She was the anti-Gwyn. While Gwyn tried to freeze the world in a state of light, Nashandra wanted to dissolve it in a state of shadow. Both were equally destructive, as they both denied the natural balance of reality. By defeating her, the player is not just saving themselves. They are saving the world from becoming a permanent extension of the abyss. We are finishing the job that Vendrick started when he took his ring and fled. Ultimately, Nashandra's final move is a failure of character. She was too patient and too greedy. She underestimated the strength of the bearer of the curse, believing that we were just another pawn to be used and discarded. Her death is the final end of the dark era of Drangleic. As she dissolves into ash, the weight of her manipulation is finally lifted from the land. But the victory is hollow, because even with the queen gone, the throne of want still waits. The path is open, the enemies are dead, and the world is silent. The final choice now rests entirely on our shoulders, just as Vendrick intended. Part 33, The Choice of the Bearer of the Curse. The death of Nashandra leaves the throne of want vacant, but it is a seat of fire, not a seat of comfort. You stand before the kiln, and for the first time in history, the choice is unclouded by the influence of a manipulator. You can choose to sit, allowing the stone doors to slide shut, and becoming the fuel that keeps the Age of Fire on life support. This is the path of the traditional monarch, a sacrifice that buys the world a few more centuries of artificial light at the cost of your own soul. It is a noble gesture, but one that ignores the reality that the fire will inevitably fade again, demanding another sacrifice in an endless bloody loop. The alternative is the path Vendrick paved by walking away. You can turn your back on the throne. She's stepping out of the kiln and into the encroaching mist. This choice signifies a rejection of the god's design. By walking away, you are stating that the cycle is a cage, and that humanity deserves a future not defined by burning itself alive. With the blessing of the crown, you are the only being who can do this without losing your mind to the curse. You become a true monarch of the dark, carrying the souls of the world into an unknown future, where the fire no longer dictates the terms of existence. This choice is the final test of your want. Do you want the power of a king within a dying system, or do you want the freedom of a man in a world that has finally stopped dreaming? The herald watches in silence, knowing that whatever you choose, the age of Drangleic is over. Sitting down is an act of hope. Walking away is an act of truth. Both are heavy, and both require the strength of a soul that has conquered the great ones. You are the final judge of a world that has been waiting for a human to speak for eons. Sitting on the throne means you accept the role of a prop. You become part of the architecture, a glowing ember in a dark box. The golems will seal you in, their mission finally complete, as the world outside experiences a brief, false spring. You are trading your eternity for a temporary reprieve for a kingdom that has already forgotten your name. It is the ultimate act of irony, becoming a god of a world you no longer inhabit. The decision to walk away, however, is the third path Aldia whispered about. It is the rejection of the binary between a dying light and a hungry dark. You are essentially taking the fire's potential and the dark's resilience and walking into the fog. You are not a savior, and you are not a lord. You are simply a survivor who refuses to play the game anymore. This choice breaks the narrative of the chosen undead entirely. Finally, the atmosphere of the throne room underscores the gravity of this moment. There are no crowds to cheer your coronation, and no gods to bless your departure. There is only the cold, indifferent stone and the fading embers of the first flame. Whether you fill the kiln or leave it cold, the story of Drangleic ends with a single individual standing in the silence. The world doesn't end with a bang or a whimper, but with the sound of a human heart making up its mind. Part 34. Aldia's Return and the Scholar's Challenge. Just as the path to the throne seems clear, the floor erupts in a mass of shifting, burning biomass. Aldia returns for one final ideological test, acting as the final barrier between you and the fire. He doesn't want your crown or your souls. He wants to know if you have the stomach for the truth he and Vendrick discovered. He is a monster of his own making, a being that exists outside the cycle, and he serves as the final check against the player's ambition. This is the scholar's final lesson, delivered through a struggle that transcends the physical. Aldia's challenge is rooted in the first sin. He reminds you that the world you are trying to save is a lie constructed by Gwyn to farm human spirits. He mocks the idea of fate, calling it a cage that prevents humanity from seeing its true face. By fighting him, you are struggling against the personification of the world's hidden history. He wants to see if you will repeat his brother's mistakes, or if you have the resolve to find a third path that neither fire nor dark can provide. He pushes you to your limit to ensure that whoever decides the fate of the world is not a mindless pawn, but a sovereign mind. He is the voice of doubt that Vendrick couldn't silence. When you defeat him, he does not die in the traditional sense. He simply recedes, satisfied that you have the strength to walk the path he could only theorize about. He leaves you with the most difficult gift of all, the realization that there is no right answer, only the choice you are brave enough to make. The battle is a cacophony of fire and philosophy. Aldia's attacks are erratic and overwhelming, mirroring the chaotic nature of the raw soul he has become. He isn't trying to conquer you, he is trying to see if you can endure the heat of the truth. He wants to know if your want is strong enough to survive the revelation that everything you've done might be meaningless. This is the ultimate vetting process for a monarch. His presence here proves that Vendrick was never truly alone in his doubt. Aldia was always the shadow behind the throne, the one who pushed the king to look past the gold and see the rot. By facing him, you are engaging with the intellect of Drangleic itself. You are fighting the very concept of the cycle. If you can defeat the scholar, you have earned the right to decide the fate of the fire. In the aftermath of the fight, the silence that follows is deafening. Aldia's fading voice tells you that there is no path, meaning the future is yours to forge from the wreckage. He has stripped away the last layer of divine guidance. You are left alone with the throne of want and the knowledge that whatever you do next, you do as a free agent. The scholar's challenge was the final fire that forged your character into something beyond a mere undead. Section 8. The Tragedy Examined. Part 35. Vendrick versus Aldia. Two paths to escape the cycle. The two brothers were united in their goal, but fundamentally divided by their methods. Vendrick chose the path of strength. He believed that through conquest, the gathering of great souls, and the construction of a massive centralized kingdom, he could outmuscle the dark. He relied on the physical world, stone, iron, and armies. His attempt to escape the cycle was a retreat into a physical vault, hiding the keys to the throne where no one, not even his queen, could reach them. He was a man of action who found that no amount of physical power can stop a metaphysical rot. Aldia chose the path of knowledge. He realized that strength was a temporary mask and sought to understand the biological and spiritual roots of the curse through horrific experimentation. He turned his home into a laboratory, attempting to recreate dragons and stitch souls together to find a way to exist outside the fire's influence. While Vendrick hid from the cycle, Aldia tried to transcend it entirely. He succeeded in becoming immortal, but at the cost of his humanity, becoming a scholar who can only observe the tragedy without being able to participate in it. The tragedy of the brothers is that neither path was sufficient on its own. Vendrick's strength was hollow without Aldia's insight, and Aldia's knowledge was a nightmare without Vendrick's restraint. Strength failed Vendrick, leaving him a naked hollow in a dark room. Knowledge drove Aldia into a state of burning, enlightened madness, forever tethered to the bonfires he tried to escape. They represent the two halves of the human struggle, the desire to control the world and the desire to understand it, both of which were crushed under the weight of the first sin. Vendrick's path was one of preservation. He wanted to keep the human form intact, even if it meant lying to his people. Aldia's path was one of evolution. He was willing to sacrifice the human form to find the truth behind the mask. One built a castle to protect a dream. The other burned down a manor to see the reality. Together, they mapped the limits of what a human can achieve in a world governed by gods, and both found that the ceiling was lower than they ever imagined. Their final states are a grim reflection of their philosophies. Vendrick is a massive body without a mind, pacing in a circle. Aldia is a massive mind without a body, flickering in the flames. They are the twin pillars of Drangleic's failure. Two men who loved their world so much they destroyed themselves trying to save it. Their story is a warning that in the face of the cycle, even the greatest strength and the deepest knowledge are just different ways to lose. Finally, the dialogue between their legacies shows a deep, fraternal respect marred by a shared despair. They knew they were failing, even as they worked. Vendrick's silence in the crypt and Aldia's constant questioning are two sides of the same grief. They are the architects of a dead world, standing as monuments to the fact that you cannot fix a system that is designed to consume you. They left the world in a stalemate, waiting for a third person to break the tie they could never resolve. Part 36. The Meaning of the Giant War. The invasion of the land of the giants was not a war for resources. It was a war for survival, born of pure, existential terror. Vendrick didn't cross the sea because he wanted more land. He crossed it because Nashandra convinced him that the giants held the key to immortality. The prize he stole was the power to bridge the gap between soul and matter, leading to the creation of the golems. This was a desperate attempt to build a kingdom that would never rot. The war was the physical manifestation of Vendrick's fear of extinction, a preemptive strike against the inevitable fading of his people. This conquest was the original sin of Drangleic. By stealing the giant's essence, Vendrick broke the natural order of the world. He turned a race of stone kin into fuel for his elevators and doors. The giant's eventual retaliation was not just a military campaign. It was the world's way of correcting Vendrick's hubris. The war turned Drangleic into a scarred wasteland and accelerated the very hollowing Vendrick was trying to prevent. It proved that you cannot build a permanent home on a foundation of stolen life. The meaning of the giant war is the realization that want leads to destruction. Vendrick's desire to save his kingdom led him to destroy another, and in doing so, he guaranteed the ruin of his own. The giants who turned into trees upon death serve as a grim contrast to the humans who turned into hollows. The giants were part of the world. Vendrick was trying to be above it. The war remains a monument to the fact that conquest is often just a loud, violent way of expressing fear. It is a story of karmic circularity. The golems that were built to protect the kingdom were made from the very souls that would eventually return to destroy it. Vendrick's great strength was his greatest liability. The war shows that in the world of dark souls, every act of aggression is eventually returned with interest. You cannot steal a future, you can only borrow it, and the giants came to collect the debt with a ferocity that broke the back of the greatest empire in history. The war also highlights Vendrick's vulnerability to manipulation. He was a man of logic who was tricked into an illogical war by his own affection for his queen. Nashandra didn't need to fight the giants. She just needed Vendrick to weaken himself so she could step over his corpse to the throne. The war was a distraction, a grand theatrical tragedy staged by the Abyss to drain the world of its strongest defenders. Finally, the giant war represents the end of Drangleic's innocence. Before the war, it was a land of gold and expansion. After the war, it was a land of rain and regret. The giants didn't just break the walls of the castle, they broke the spirit of the king. They left behind a world of hollows and trees, a landscape where the boundary between life and death had been permanently blurred by the violence of a man who was too afraid to let go. Part 37. Why Vendrick could not save his kingdom. Vendrick failed because he tried to solve a spiritual problem with political and military solutions. He built the most impressive kingdom in history, but he did so by ignoring the fundamental truth that the Age of Fire is a temporary state. He had the power to move mountains and defeat the four great ones, but he lacked the understanding of why the world was fading in the first place. He was playing a game of chess against the laws of physics. His strength was a distraction that prevented him from seeing the first sin until it was too late to act. He also could not save Drangleic because he was compromised from within. His love for Nashandra blinded him to the rot in his own throne room. By the time he realized she was a fragment of the Abyss, the kingdom's foundations were already eaten away. He was a king who could delegate the building of walls, but he could not delegate the protection of his own heart. His power was external, the threat was internal. He was a giant who was being led by a leash held by a shadow, and by the time he cut the leash, he had nowhere left to go. Vendrick's failure was the failure of the great man theory of history. He believed a single monarch could hold back the dark. He didn't realize that the curse was not a disease to be cured, but a reckoning for the world's artificiality. He tried to save a kingdom that was never meant to last, and his refusal to link the fire, while a brave philosophical stand, was the final nail in the coffin for his subjects. He saved the truth, but he let his people burn in the process. His methods, the golems, the soul trapping, the manipulation of the life force, were themselves corrupt. You cannot create a holy kingdom using the tools of the curse. Vendrick was trying to fight the dark with a different shade of dark. He was a visionary who lacked a clean mirror, and by the time he saw the reflection of what he had actually created, the image was too distorted to recognize. The weight of the souls he carried also contributed to his downfall. A king is only as strong as the souls he commands, but those souls come with the baggage of their previous owners. By absorbing the great souls, Vendrick was inviting the stagnation of the old world into his own spirit. He wasn't building something new. He was just rearranging the furniture of a haunted house. He was doomed by the very power he thought would save him. Finally, Vendrick was a man of peace who was forced into a world of want. He wanted to be a philosopher king, but the world demanded a sacrifice. He could not reconcile his moral compass with the demands of the first flame. He chose his own integrity over the survival of his state, proving that a good man is often a bad king in a universe designed for monsters. Part 38. The king who lost his queen, his brother, and himself. Beneath the grand political collapse of Drangleic lies the story of a man whose personal life was a series of devastating losses. Vendrick's tragedy is defined by the three pillars of his existence crumbling one by one. First, he lost his brother, Aldia, to the madness of the manor. The one person who shared his intellectual burden became a burning monster he could no longer recognize. This left Vendrick alone in his search for answers, deprived of his only peer and his greatest advisor. Then he lost his queen. The realization that Nashandra never loved him, that she was a predatory shard of the abyss using him as a tool, was a psychological death blow. He had built Drangleic as a gift for her, only to find that he had built a playground for a monster. This betrayal turned his home into a crime scene. He was a husband who had been sleeping next to his own destruction, and the shame of that gullibility is what drove him into the dark of the crypt. Finally, he lost himself. The man who once stood tall as the conqueror of the great ones ended his life as a mindless hollow, pacing in a circle in a lightless room. He discarded his clothes, his crown, and his sword because he could no longer bear the weight of who he used to be. The hollowing was his final retreat from a reality that had become too painful to inhabit. The personal tragedy of Vendrick is that he ended his journey with nothing but the dust of his own memories. A king who had lost everything that gave his life meaning long before he actually died. He became a ghost in his own castle before he ever set foot in the crypt. The isolation was absolute. He couldn't go to his brother for help, and he couldn't go to his wife for comfort. He was a man trapped in a house of mirrors, where every reflection showed him a version of his own failure. His hollowing was not a disease. It was a surrender to the fact that he was already spiritually extinct. This triad of loss is what makes Vendrick the most human character in the series. He didn't fail because he was weak. He failed because he was vulnerable. He loved his brother and he loved his wife. And in the world of Dark Souls, love is a liability that the Abyss knows how to exploit. His greatness was just a larger target for the tragedy to hit. Finally, the image of him in the crypt is the final punctuation mark on his life. He isn't a king anymore. He's just a man who ran out of people to care about. The silence of his chamber is the silence of a life where every connection has been severed. He is the ultimate example of how the cycle takes everything: your world, your family, and eventually, your very identity. Part 39. Was Vendrick a failure, or the first to see the truth? Reframing Vendrick's legacy requires looking past the ruins of his castle. While he is often seen as a failure for allowing his kingdom to fall, he was actually the first monarch to truly see through the deception of the gods. By refusing to link the fire, he committed an act of revolutionary honesty. He recognized that the heroism of previous ages was just a cycle of suicide and stagnation. He chose to be a failure as a king so that he could be a success as a human who refused to be a pawn. His failure to save Drangleic was actually a tactical sacrifice to save the future. By hiding the keys to the throne and retreating to the crypt, he ensured that Nashandra and the abyss she represented could not claim the fire. He was a guardian of the end. He accepted the role of the villain or the coward in history to prevent a much worse catastrophe. He understood that sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to stop playing it. Vendrick was the first to realize that dark is the natural bloom of the soul and that the fire is a fleeting, artificial dream. His doubt was his greatest achievement. He didn't leave a kingdom. He left an inheritance of skepticism and autonomy. He proved that it is possible to hold a great soul and still choose to walk away. In the eyes of the cycle, he was a disaster. In the eyes of humanity, he was the first man to finally wake up. He transformed the concept of the true monarch from a military title to a philosophical state. To be a king was no longer about ruling over men, but about ruling over one's own want. By refusing the throne, he achieved a level of sovereignty that Gwyn or the Iron King could never understand. He was a pioneer of the human spirit, even if he had to crawl through the mud to reach that realization. If he had linked the fire, Drangleic would have been just another footnote in the cycle of Lordran. By refusing, he forced the world to confront its own decay. He was the one who stopped the clock, allowing the bearer of the curse to finally see the machinery behind the face. His failure was the necessary precursor to the player's potential victory. Finally, Vendrick's legacy is the blessing of the crown. He spent his last coherent moments figuring out how to protect a human mind from the curse. This proves his intent was always preservation, just not the kind the gods wanted. He succeeded in creating a path for a human to remain human in the dark. He wasn't a failure. He was a martyr for a truth that was too heavy for a kingdom to carry. Part 40. The King Who Lost Everything. The story of King Vendrick ends in the silence of the undead crypt. There are no fanfares, no final speeches, and no grand monuments to mark his passing. There is only a massive, hollowed man shuffling in the dark, his skin the color of ash, and his mind a blank slate. He is the ultimate symbol of the 1 a.m. atmosphere of Drangleic, a world that has stayed up too late and forgotten why it was awake in the first place. He is a king who achieved the heights of human potential, only to find that the view from the top was a landscape of ruins. He lost his kingdom to a curse, his heart to a shadow, and his mind to the dark. Yet in that total loss, there is a strange kind of peace. He is no longer burdened by the want that destroyed everyone else. He is finally still. The artifacts he left behind, his armor in the pile, his ring in the shrine, are the only things that remain of the man who once moved the world. They are the echoes of a life lived with immense ambition and even greater regret. When you strike him down in his chamber, it is not a battle. It is a mercy. You are releasing the last of his want so that he can finally fade into the dark he sought. Vendrick stands as a reminder that even the greatest among us are ultimately just travelers passing through a world that doesn't belong to us. He was a king of stone and soul who found that in the end, the only thing that matters is the clarity you find in the dark. He lost everything, and in doing so, he gave the world its first real chance to start over. The memory of the king is all that survives, a flickering image of a man who was wise enough to know he was a fool. His legacy is not the stones of Drangleic, but the doubt in the heart of every player who stands before the throne. He is the ghost that haunts the age of men, a warning and a guide for anyone brave enough to seek a path beyond the flame. As the light in the crypt finally dies, the story of the King of Drangleic settles into the dust. He was a man who tried to be a god and found he was only human. He was a hero who chose to be a failure. He was the king who lost everything so that we might finally find something worth keeping. Finally, Vendrick's end is the most honest moment in the game. It strips away the myth of the great king and leaves only the reality of the undead. He is the mirror for the player. In his shuffle, his silence, and his nakedness, we see our own reflection. He is the beginning and the end of the journey. The man who walked until he could walk no more, leaving the rest of the road to us,